Hi, everyone. I'm here today with Dr. Michelle Suarez, who is an associate professor in occupational therapy at Western Michigan University.
Mhm.
She got her PhD in interdisciplinary health science,
Mhm.
also from Western Michigan University. And we're going to talk about Michelle's clinical research in the field of food selectivity.
Yeah.
Welcome, Michelle.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Let's start by just having you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got involved in this specialty area.
Yeah. So I started my career at a larger rehabilitation hospital in Michigan, and they had a feeding program as part of that, the outpatient pediatrics department. And I had never really even heard of food selectivity before I started there, but it was just so fascinating to me and worrisome that these just beautiful kids, they're walking and talking and playing, but they would literally rather starve than put a non-preferred food in their mouth. And it was really difficult to treat these kids. They appeared to be having such a strong fight or flight reaction to non-preferred foods. And we didn't have a lot of knowledge about food selectivity at the time. But I went to the literature and I started reading, and a lot of what I found was related to kind of a behavioral approach to treating food selectivity. So a lot of it talked about using escape extinction, which essentially is, putting the child in the feeding chair, putting the food in front of them and saying, take a bite. And they could cry or, hit or vomit, but they're really expected to stay in that feeding situation until they take a bite of that non-preferred food.
So
Um,
does that approach have a reinforcement pattern? I mean,
yeah.
how do you keep the child there?
Yeah, well, I mean, in theory, what they're saying is that the child's escape from the feeding situation is reinforcing their refusal to
I
eat.
see. Mhm.
So, they require them to stay and take a bite. And in essence, they're not reinforcing that escape
I
anymore.
see.
So according to the literature, it works pretty quickly. The kids will, do a lot to get out of that really uncomfortable situation. But what we don't know is, what that does to the child's sense of self-efficacy and feelings of hunger and their feeding relationship with their parent.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
the whole feeding scenario is impacted by what you're saying was the
yeah,
fight or flight and
yeah.
negative emotional experience around food, right?
Yeah, yeah. And that doesn't fit real well with our philosophy in occupational therapy. We practice real holistic, client-centered care. And I don't know that parents, a lot of times can't, that's hard for them to see. And, we don't know longitudinally if these kids are able to sustain these changes.
Right.
So that was a worry for me. And then I think finally that it doesn't address what might be some of the underlying reasons for the child's food refusal.
Sure.
Yeah. So, just kind of looking at different ways and kind of investigating what we might be able to do that is a little bit more holistic and child-centered. I started a PhD, as you mentioned, at Western Michigan University, and one of the things that I really wanted to know was, what are some of the underlying factors related to food selectivity for these kids? And I think as occupational therapists, I think that there's sort of maybe a common knowledge, this just might be my perception, but a
Mhm.
common knowledge that there is some sensory processing issues related to food selectivity, but I
Sure.
couldn't find documentation of that in the literature. I mean, there was a few studies
Mhm.
or a few kind of literature reviews that kind of pointed in that direction. So that's one of the first things that I wanted to do is just look at the relationship between sensory over-responsivity and food selectivity. So that was kind of the focus of my
Yeah.
dissertation. Yeah.
So it
So
wasn't, you weren't engaging in any intervention, you were really just trying to
right.
characterize this sample.
Yeah, characterize the sample and document that that could be a possibility and something that we need to think about when we're planning treatment, that these kids may be having this sympathetic nervous system fight or flight response to the sensations of eating, and that's something that we should honor and we should include as part of a treatment protocol.
Right. So I'm just trying to clarify, in your dissertation, did you
Mhm.
identify any patterns or subtypes of sensory processing challenges that these kids presented with?
Yeah, so we were able to establish, so my dissertation committee and I established a relationship between sensory overresponsivity and the number of foods that a child accepted as part of their regular diet. And then
Hmm.
we repeated that, was a survey study of
Yes.
parents of children with autism. We repeated that, I think it was about 2 years later, and that relationship persisted in those same kids. So it was kind of a longitudinal
Oh,
examination of that.
and was it one particular sensory domain that was impacted, or was it over responsivity across many domains?
We didn't look at that real specifically, and I think that that's a question for further research. But sensory overresponsivity in general was associated with
Okay.
the number of foods. Yeah. So from there, I ended up, I'm teaching at Western Michigan University. And as part of that role, I do quite a bit of clinical supervision. So we have our own level 1 clinics at Western. So I supervise the pediatric outpatient clinics there. And as part of that, we decided to start a food selectivity clinic. So working with my students, we kind of created this food selectivity clinic and started to, experiment or put into action some of the things that we were seeing sort of in trainings and, in the field related to more holistic, client-centered ways to address food selectivity. So over time, we developed a treatment protocol. We call it the Just Right Challenge Feeding Protocol, where we work to add new foods to children's diets. And the way that we do that is using systematic desensitization, as well as some behavioral strategies. So we do use some quasi-escape extinction, but at a level of a just right challenge. So
Hmm.
we're trying to observe the child, figure out their tolerance for particular goal foods, and then work them up a food interaction hierarchy. We kind of set expectations. So based on our observations of the kids, the expectation one week might be just that they have it on their plate and they're required to meet that expectation. If that's easy for them as clinicians, we're going to decide what that next just right challenge is. The next week we communicate an expectation. We use food interaction hierarchy strips. So we have different levels of that food interaction hierarchy. So having it on your plate, being able to smell it, touch it, kiss it, all the way up to eating the food. So we'll highlight the step that we expect the child to achieve that week, and we work with them to be able to do that before they're able to leave the feeding situation. They take a break, we do some sensory motor type activities or whatever we've determined is going to be regulating for them, and then bring them back to the table and move on to the next food.
So is this related at all to the SOS approach that Dr. Kay Toomey uses in her clinic?
Yeah, so I think it's informed by Kay Toomey's approach. I think that her work related to systematic desensitization is kind of, at least in my opinion, was kind of revolutionary for me as a feeding therapist. Um, and I think the element that we add to that is just, setting this requirement for where in the food interaction hierarchy the child is required to, how they're required to engage with that particular goal food during what we call our clinical meal.
Mhm.
And we kind of have a structure to the session that we follow, and students are able to follow pretty closely with fidelity. So we've been able to go forward and do some single subject research related to our protocol.
Right. And just, I might as well mention it now because I was thinking
Yeah,
I should have introduced you as one of our first research mentees in single
yeah.
subject research design. And that's how Michelle and I got to know each other. And I guess that was sort of the foundation for
Mhm.
the next study that you conducted about, which was on
Yes.
the effectiveness of your program. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah. So, I think that the training that I did was really helpful at helping me. I mean, I think single subject research can make you a better clinician, really, because you think about like what are you trying to measure and how can you operationalize that? How can you capture that and how can you do that in a systematic, frequent way? So I think through that training, I really was able to examine what we were doing and figure out kind of how to measure that and the components that we were using and that might be working. And from that, I was able to get some mentorship from you, which was really nice. We were able to get a grant from Blue Cross Blue Shield Foundation of Michigan.
Wow.
Um, yeah, to do the single subject work. So we studied our protocol recently and we were able to publish in the Open Journal of Occupational Therapy. So that just came out recently.
Yeah. So what were the outcomes that you were looking at with those kids?
Yeah, so we were looking at their food inventory was one of the primary outcomes. So before the children started, we had a wait list for our treatment at our clinic. We would send the family a food inventory every week and we would have them check off which foods that their child accepted that past week.
Mhm.
And typically that's pretty easy for the families to remember because often their kids eat the exact same things every single week. I mean, every single day, so they would check those off. And then we began treatment and we continue to collect that food inventory every week through treatment.
Mhm.
So we were able to demonstrate that kids with sensory over-responsivity and food selectivity added a significant amount of foods to their inventory based on that parent report.
And was there like, did it increase? So what was the average number of foods that they were able to add to their diet during the intervention, or how did you map out what
Yeah,
that
yeah.
change?
So we were able to get a stable baseline.
Mhm.
So, some kids started, we had one in the study that started with one food. And, that was very stable for a period of time. And then we began treatment. And then by the end of the study, I believe he had 18 foods that he was eating. Yep. And the amount of time that children were with us ranged from about 21 to 46 months. But I think the average was probably about 21 to 46 sessions, not
Okay.
months. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So weeks really, because we did once a week. So I think the average was probably about 30 sessions.
Mhm.
And then we had other kids, with less severe food selectivity. So I think we had another that had about 8 foods as part of his regular diet, and he ended with about 25 foods.
Mhm.
So, it depended on the child and where they started. But yeah, we were able to increase that.
Did you have any other like just a pre-post measures in addition to the repeated measure that you used?
Yeah, so we also used a measure of mealtime quality called About Your Child's Eating. It was published by Davis years ago. And, it's just questions about the family meal. So we did that pre and post, and there was a significant difference in the mealtime quality from pre to post for
Mhm.
the kids. Um, we ran some non-parametric, pre to post t-tests, so Wilcoxon, to look at food inventory from pre to post, and there was a significant change in
Right.
that as well. Um, and we also, kind of looked at session progression. So we actually have a manuscript that we're going to try to publish very soon that just looks at how long it takes a child to actually eat a new food in the clinic.
Mhm.
So we're tracking in our session data what step they're able to get to on our food interaction hierarchy ladder. So we're going to be able to just kind of show how long it will take to make progress with kids, so clinicians have an idea of what they should expect in terms of the progression for kids.
Yeah, I wonder, because as you were talking, I was thinking about just the parents' experience.
Yes.
Being able even to do some qualitative interviews of
Yeah.
the parents' experience, their
Yes.
sense of competence in and
Yes.
joy from being with their child. I mean, because mealtime is a time when people socialize.
I know. Yeah.
It's it's around food that people usually celebrate,
It's
and
true.
so if you have such a negative early experience, that shift should be pretty impactful to the whole family system.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't mention that a big part of this protocol is the family education and home programming that we do. And even in the clinic, we start with sort of modeling for the parents, and then, we have them kind of take over and we'll coach them in the session. So by the end, they're doing a lot of it themselves. And then we transfer that to the home, and they have specific things that they need to do at home every week that we hold each other accountable to when they come back. And, we have lots of anecdotal stories that families tell us. I mean, all OTs have those things, but there was this one young man, he was 13, and the family could never go out to eat with him because everything had to be exactly how his mom typically prepared it. He had
Right.
very few foods. And, they wanted to go on vacation, and they wanted to be able to, go out to a restaurant. And so they did that, and they went out one day, and he ordered popcorn shrimp off the menu, and he thought it was popcorn because that was one of his foods. And his mom's like, "Are you sure you want popcorn shrimp, buddy? They have chicken strips, you could try that." And he said, "Nope, I want popcorn shrimp." And he ate it, and the waitress tried to take it away at one point because she thought he was done. And for the first time ever, he said, "No, leave my food here." So a little guy with autism, and so stuff like that. Just that's why we do what we do.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely. What a great little story.
Yeah. Yeah.
Are you thinking about, I know you talked about one paper that you have, but are you thinking about doing a group design? Would you have a
Mhm.
control condition, or what are your thoughts about what you might want to investigate further?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot more work that needs to be done. Again, the single subject research training helped me to think about components of the treatment and which might, be the most effective. So, I can't say for sure that you need that behavioral component, or you necessarily need the regulation activities that we put in before the clinical meal. Maybe we could make progress without those. So I don't think so, but I think looking at those components would be important. I think you're right, doing a qualitative study and asking parents about their experiences, and if they feel like, they're able to enjoy mealtime more, if their family is more peaceful during that time, if they're making less of a short order cook, type thing. So I think that would be great. I think it would be nice to do a larger, randomized control trial. That's expensive and
Yes.
tricky, as I've learned, in research. But, I think that would be great if we could do that in the future. But, we'll kind of see. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the beauty of the single subject design, just as you described, is you can add in different components and you
Yeah.
can still look at, the same outcomes. And actually, you might find different outcomes now
Yeah.
that you want to have as a repeated measure, maybe even just a regulation measure to
Sure.
how regulated the kids can stay. Because then you can look at the value added benefit of
Yes.
each
Yes.
layer that you're adding on. But as you were talking about that, it made me wonder, do you have a particular structure? You've talked about regulation activities, and then I think you made mention of some sensory motor activities.
Yes.
Wonder if there's if you could just sort of go through a
Yeah.
typical structure of
Sure.
the session with us.
Yeah, so we do have a typical structure, and not every kid, we're going to individualize it for each kid, but I teach the students this structure. And typically we start with some sort of oral motor warm-up activity. And as oral motor input can be really regulating. So we'll do sucking and blowing and different sorts of breathing exercises and activities. So not only for regulation, but we also might be addressing some oral motor dysfunction during this time, just depending on the child. So we would, individualize those for the child. And then we typically move on to some sort of tactile exploration activity. So we'll do some sort of food craft, usually. And we always use what we call always food. So, healthy whole grains and fruits and vegetables and proteins versus sometimes foods, your birthday cake, your ice cream. So we try to incorporate goal foods and always foods. And during that time, it's meant to be a way to connect with the therapist, to enjoy yourself, and there's no pressure to eat during that tactile food exploration.
Right.
Then we move on to a regulation type activity. So it could be a sensory motor activity like an obstacle course if the child's benefits from some heavy work or for some slow linear vestibular or whatever. We do sensory profiles when they start, and we identify the things that are going to be regulating for them. So then after they're regulated, they go through that, whatever it is for them. It's meant to be fun and play-based too. And again, it's a time to connect with the therapist, to develop that rapport and that safety.
Right.
Then we move to what we call the clinical meal. So we've identified goals with their family. So we had food goals. We've observed the child engaging with those foods, and we have identified what a just right challenge would be on the food interaction hierarchy.
Mm-hmm.
We present the child with a strip of paper with the step that they need to reach that week. And we work up the hierarchy if they need it to reach that step with that particular goal food. So after they do that, we cheer, we might do stickers, whatever's going to be reinforcing for them. And then they get up again and they're going to go through a regulation activity. Mm-hmm. They do that and they come back to the table and do their second food. So we usually repeat that sequence about 5 times. You usually have 5 or so goal foods. And once we get through all of them, we celebrate at the end. We give the child the homework that they're supposed to do over the week and explain that to the parent. And then we reflect on, what is the next step for the child on that interaction hierarchy. So what are we going to do the next week with them when they come back?
Yeah. So, so it sounds like is there a certain age range or cognitive level that you feel the program is most effective for?
Yeah, so I would say about 3 through maybe 10 years of age, although, we have had kids that are older, particularly kids with autism that developmentally are a little bit younger. So like that 13-year-old young man with autism, developmentally, socially, he was a bit younger. When the child isn't cognitively able to, follow one-step direction or have some language, we might use a different approach for that child. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, and it also sounds like if you're doing sensory profiles on all of the kids coming in, you also have a retrospective chart at your fingertips to maybe delve into what the unique sensory domains that are impacted in these kids. Because I wonder to what extent even some, not just over-responsivity, but maybe some under-responsivity could be impacting on their choices, because if you don't get a lot of feedback from food, who wants to eat it, right?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's a really good point. And that's something that we haven't.
May not feel the hunger or whatever. I don't know. It just would be interesting to delve into that.
Yeah, and I'm betting there are, some different subcategories of backgrounds for children with food selectivity. And I'm betting that the way we treat those, would need to be different. So, I think that is a direction for further research.
Yeah. And even just thinking about how quickly a child progresses up that ladder, are there certain features that are associated with kids who maybe need more repeated presentation of those new foods versus those who can progress a little bit more quickly? Like what impacts the speed or rate of change that a kiddo might
Yes.
make?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And in the study that I mentioned, the single subject study that we just published, we used percent of non-overlapping data as kind of a measure of effectiveness and effect size.
Right.
And when we looked at each of the children, really only the children with sensory over-responsivity were, this was very effective for them.
Mhm.
We had another little guy in that study that didn't have sensory over-responsivity, and it wasn't very effective for him. And a lot of, I think, what was going on with him was just availability of foods at home.
Mhm.
So we were able to kind of address that with the family. Like, parent says, well, I want my child to eat more fruits and vegetables. Well, if you don't have fruits and vegetables in the house, that's not going to happen. And we didn't know that until we got into it a little bit, I think, kind of classifying the reasons, whether it's under responsivity, over responsivity, the relationship in feeding, that can help guide treatment as well. And I think those are definitely directions for future research.
Yeah, absolutely. Have you compiled this program into any kind of a manualized approach, or do you have any plans to do that, or to even offer it maybe to some clinicians who are interested in learning more about this approach?
Yep. So, I did a training on MedBridge, that's there. And then definitely doing some writing to kind of compile what we have. I mean, we have a manual that's kind of loose at this point. We have kind of a fidelity instrument to go with that. But, there's a possibility of maybe even just publishing that online so that it could be available for people. So it's something, that we've definitely considered,
Yeah.
but it
Well,
hasn't been done yet.
we might approach you and provide you a platform to do maybe
Yeah,
a webinar on this approach. But I do think that you've mentioned two things that, just since we've been talking about research, are really critical components of any intervention study, which
yeah,
is to have the protocol or manual,
yes,
of what the program looks like, what are the key principles that underlie
yes,
it, what's the structure of it,
yeah,
as well as the fidelity checks, so that you can ensure when, in your case, the students are
yeah,
conducting the study, that in fact they meet all of the criteria
right.
for that intervention.
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously really important, because you can't say something does or doesn't work if you haven't been faithful to the tenets and the steps. And I think that that's a really important point.
Yeah,
Something that we
absolutely.
could continue to try to get out there. Yeah.
Yeah, well, this has been so informative. I'm so grateful
Oh,
for you to take the time to talk to us. And I think that, there are a lot of clinicians who are working in this area. And certainly, I think it's fairly well documented that children on the autism spectrum do tend to have more issues around restricted food intake,
hmm.
and is a big area, I think, for OT to stay really involved in.
Yeah, well, I've been grateful to be included, so it's been fun.
Good,
Yeah,
good. All right. Well, like I said, maybe we'll have a webinar in the future with you. So thank you
great.
for your time again.
Yes, thank you for having me.